When I was little, my grandparents had a way of telling stories that made the room go quiet. They didn't spin yarns just to scare us, or dress things up for effect. They spoke plain, the way country people do when they're just laying out the facts. Some nights it would be around the kitchen table, my grandma shelling peas while Grandpa smoked his pipe. Other times it was by the wood stove in the living room, fire popping low, shadows dancing across the walls. That was when the stories came out. Not all of them stuck with me, but one definitely did. It was the story of the winter when something stalked their cabin, deep during a snowstorm in Ontario. I noticed early that neither of them ever laughed when they told it. No winks, no nudges, no just kiddings or gotchas. Grandpa's voice would go steady and flat, and Grandma would nod along at every detail, sometimes filling in a part he left out. They never argued over what happened. The memory seemed carved into both of them the same way. And the story never changed. Not when I was 7, sitting cross-legged on the rug. Not when I was 20, home from college and hearing it again over coffee. Every time, the same order, the same details. They swore a Wendigo stalked their cabin one winter. That's how Grandma always framed it. And Grandpa, with that hard look in his eye, would add, "I don't care what anyone says. I know what I shot at." It was the only story they ever told that made me feel scared. The only story they ever told that made the fire feel colder. My grandparents built their cabin in the late 1950s, back when the land was cheap and hard work was worth more than money. It sat deep in the woods of northern Ontario, miles from the nearest neighbor, farther still from town. A logging road, cut close enough to haul supplies in the summer. But once the snow came, that road was nothing but a white scar swallowed by trees. Life out there wasn't easy. Winters lasted for what seemed like forever, and when the storms rolled in, they came down like walls, burying the cabin in drifts taller than a man. Food had to be hunted, trapped, canned ahead of time. My grandma kept a root cellar stacked with jars and potatoes, and Grandpa ran trap lines through the forest, bringing back pelts and meat when luck was on his side. Electricity never reached that far. They lit kerosene lamps, burned wood day and night, and drew water by hand when the pump froze. The isolation didn't bother them. They were used to making do with what they had, and their families had raised them out in the woods anyway. But it meant that when trouble came, there wasn't anyone to call, and there wasn't anyone close enough to hear. Grandma used to say those winters built the kind of silence you don't understand until you've lived through one. No cars on the road, no hum of power lines, not even the sound of planes overhead. Just the groan of the cabin timbers and the low howl of wind across the ridge. It was peaceful in its way, but lonely too, and definitely dangerous. So that was the setting. 2 young people in a cabin, with 2 young children asleep in the loft. My dad wasn't even born yet. The world was locked down under snow, and it was in that silence that the trouble started. Grandma always said the first sign was the rabbits. Grandpa would check his traps and find them mangled, ribs busted open like they were just kindling, meat stripped from them. At first, he thought maybe a lynx or a wolf had gotten to them, but the kills were wrong. Too clean in some ways, too savage in others. It wasn't wolverines or badgers or anything like that was getting to these creatures. And then it was foxes. One was left half buried in the snow, its chest torn open, eyes glazed and frozen. Another was scattered in pieces along a trail, like something had shaken it apart and tossed the scraps behind. Grandpa started resetting the traps closer to the cabin, uneasy about leaving them that far out. But the worst was the closest neighbor's dog. It was Grandpa's friend Gus, and it had taken him all day to get over to Grandpa to tell him what had happened. You see, folks didn't keep many pets out there. Dogs were workers, not playthings. But this one had been loyal, trained, tough enough to face down a bear if it had to. Gus found him lying still, stiff near the edge of the property. His chest was ripped open the same way as the smaller animals. Grandma said the look on Grandpa's face that day told her more than anything that the carcass could. He knew whatever was moving through the woods wasn't a normal predator at that point. And then there were the tracks. Not many, but enough to rattle them. Prints long and narrow, sunk deep into the snow, toes pointed strange, uneven strides, as if something too tall and too heavy had loped its way past. There were no claw marks, no neat paw shapes like a wolf leaves behind. Just impressions that seemed wrong no matter how long you stared at them. Word could spread fast in that small community, even as spread out as the people were. Men on trap lines muttered something about strange moving throughs in the forest. Women at the general store warned each other to keep children close. Nobody had proof, but everyone had whispers. And it was only once a month or so that Grandma actually made it to the general store. My grandparents didn't call it a Wendigo. Not then. But they said the woods had gone different. Quieter. As if even the crows didn't want to hang around. It didn't stay with the trap lines either. Before long, my grandparents said, the nights around the cabin grew restless. It started with small sounds, sharp cracks in the wood, like branches being snapped in big hands. At first, Grandpa thought it was a moose pushing through brush, but the timing felt off. Always just after the lamps were blown out. Always just when the house was settling quiet. It was like that thing was waiting for everything to go dark. Then came the pacing noises. Heavy crunches around the house, in the snow, circling the cabin. Back and forth, around and around, as if whatever it was wanted them to know that it was there. Grandma said the steps were too measured to be an animal. They sounded like a man's boots, only heavier and kind of dragging. Even inside, they couldn't escape it. The smell seeped through the chinks in the logs. Rot mixed with iron like rusted metal dipped in blood. It hung in the air so strong that my aunt, just a little girl then, gagged and begged to sleep with her head under the covers. Sometimes they woke to the sound of scratching. Not mice, not claws small and quick. This was long, deliberate strokes like nails dragging across wood. One morning, they found marks carved into the outside wall, deep enough to cut the grain. Grandpa ran his hand over them and didn't say a word, but Grandma saw how tight his jaw was set. The children, my aunt and uncle at the time, were terrified. They cried at night, begged to go to town, begged not to be left alone. They were just tiny children at that point, not even big enough to go out and help around the house. Grandma told me she'd made them promise one thing: never look out of the windows after dark. She said curiosity was the one thing that would break them, and she wasn't about to give whatever was out there the satisfaction of children's eyes staring back. The pacing, the scratching, that stink, it went on for days, and with each night, the feeling grew heavier, as though the cabin itself was shrinking under the weight of something circling, waiting, and deciding when to attack. Grandma said the worst part wasn't the steps or even the smell. It was when the voices started. One night, after the children had finally cried themselves to sleep, she and Grandpa sat by the fire, listening to the wind whistle low through the cracks. That's when they both heard it. Her name. Lucy. Called from the tree line, soft and flat, like someone who hadn't used their voice in years. At first, she thought maybe a neighbor had wandered close, but no one came out that far in the dead of winter, and especially not at night. Not without good reason. And they wouldn't be calling her name from the trees, they'd be knocking on the front door. She glanced over at my grandpa, and before she could speak, he said that he heard it too. They waited, listening hard, and then it came again. Same pitch, same tone, too exact. Lucy. Grandpa stood, grabbed his lantern, cracked the door. The yard stretched empty under the moonlight, snow smooth except for the prints that had circled days before. No man stood there. No neighbor was calling. Just the echo of his wife's name hanging in the air. The next night, it was his turn. His name this time, rasped from the dark, drawn out until it sounded barely human. Gerard. He shut the door hard and dropped the bar into place. But it didn't stop. Night after night, the voice came. Sometimes it called both their names, back and forth like it was trying to decide which one of them to hunt, which one of them to torment, which one of them to draw out and devour. Sometimes it repeated the same word over and over until it lost shape and turned into a noise. Then it was just broken syllables strung together, half nonsense, half laugh, always close, never far, as though it knew that they were listening, that they were waiting for that thing to talk again. Sometimes it would say, "Come out." Other times it would say, "Come here." More often than not, it would say their names. Lucy. Gerard. Grandpa started keeping the rifle propped by the door. Normally, he only loaded it when he was heading out to hunt because he didn't want the kids around it, but now he left it ready, cartridges tucked tight, barrel clean. He told Grandma plain and simple, "If it comes close, I'm pulling the trigger." She never argued. The night it finally came close, Grandma said the whole cabin shook. It seemed it was almost midnight. The fire had burned down to coals. The children were curled together under quilts in the loft. Then came a thud against the wall, so heavy it rattled the crockery on the shelves. Snow slid from the roofs in sheets, thumping to the ground hard enough to make the timbers groan. Grandpa grabbed the rifle. He'd been waiting for this. The pacing wasn't slow anymore. There were heavy steps crunching in the snow, circling fast as though whatever had stalked them for days was done playing, and now it wanted them. The sound moved from one wall to the next, always just outside, too quick to be a man, too heavy to be a deer, too calculated to be any type of animal. It was circling, looking for a way in, trying to draw them out. That smell, that disgusting, putrid odor, poured through the cracks. Thick wrought and rusted iron, enough to sting their eyes. The children woke at the commotion and started crying, asking what was out there. Grandma pulled them close, whispering for them not to look, not to even make a sound. And then the scratching started. Long strokes up the walls, nails or claws dragging down the logs, each one deeper than the last. The cabin shuddered with it, as if the thing wanted to peel its way inside. Grandpa had enough. He shoved open the shutters just a crack, lantern light spilling onto the snow, and he saw it. It was near the tree line, just past the yard, standing tall. It was swaying back and forth like the wind moved it because it was so skinny and frail. But the trees behind him were still. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, fingers black against the white snow. It didn't step forward, not yet. It only leaned, watching, the way a wolf watches sheep from a ridge. The children were whimpering. Grandma held them tighter. And then it came closer. One slow stride and then another, until the prints in the snow deepened halfway to the cabin. This was Grandpa's moment. He didn't wait. He threw the door open wide, raised the rifle, and fired. The echo blasted over the hills, sharp and final, echoing into the night. The scream that thing let loose was horrible. Grandma said it wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was both and neither at the same time. A ragged wail that rattled the windows and sent the children into hysterical sobs. That thing, the Wendigo, lurched back, twisted like it had been struck, and vanished into the trees in 2 impossible strides. The woods swallowed it whole. Only the echo of that scream hung frozen in the air. Grandpa stood in the doorway, rifle barrel smoking, eyes fixed on the tree line, ready for another shot. He didn't move until the night went quiet again. It was like the wind didn't even dare to return. When he finally shut the door, Grandma said his face was pale but set. He only said one thing before sitting back down at the table. "It knows we'll fight now." When morning came, Grandpa was out the door before the rest of the family even stirred. Grandma followed minutes later. She was bundled tight. The children had awoke and were clinging to her skirt. The yard told the story plain. The snow was torn up in wide circles where the footsteps had paced through the night. They were pressed deep and uneven, like something too heavy had stalked just beyond the walls. They circled the house. Things that they had outside had been disturbed and knocked over. But what froze them wasn't the tracks. It was the sight of the blood. Thick black patches stained the snow where Grandpa's bullet had struck that thing. The stuff looked wrong, though. Oily, almost like tar, not like blood. But Grandpa was sure that this is the thing that creature had bled. The stench rose up sharp, worse than a gut pile, worse than anything they'd smelled in all their years hunting. It was like rotten meat mixed with iron so strong it made Grandma gag. And then the strangest part. There were only certain tracks leading away. The blood stopped at the tree line, and beyond the snow lay smooth, untouched areas, as if that thing had simply vanished into thin air. They stayed on the edge the rest of the winter, the rifle always loaded, another rifle borrowed from a friend. lamps burning late into the night, but it never came back. There was no more pacing, no more scratching, no more voices in the dark trying to get them to come out. Just silence, heavy and watchful, as if the woods themselves were waiting for that thing to come back. Years later, my dad was born. He grew up on that story. Even though he wasn't born yet and couldn't witness it, his siblings remembered that winter. He believes it to be completely true. Now, when they told the story, they swore every detail was accurate, that nothing was embellished. The smell, the scream, the blood that didn't look like any blood should. They never added to it, never took away from it, always told the exact same story. Grandma said that it was written in a diary for so long that she memorized it. She'd written it down to just prove that everything that they said was real. And over the years, she read that diary over and over until every word was memorized. And Grandpa always ended the story the same way. He set his jaw, looked at each of us straight in the eyes, and said, "I don't care if you believe me. I know what I shot at." People call me reckless, and maybe they're right. I've always had this itch for pushing myself farther than I should. Skydiving, when no one else wants to, mine. Cliff jumping, without ropes, just to feel the bite of fear in my chest, done. Camping alone, where most folks won't even hike, that's my idea of heaven. Adrenaline's like a fuel for me. I don't drink, I don't gamble, I don't do drugs, but I'll put myself in the middle of nowhere with a thin line between me and death. That's fun for me. That's what brought me to the mountains of British Columbia in the dead of winter. A buddy of mine had told me about a remote ridge that hardly anyone touches when the snow sets. Too much risk, he said. Too easy to get stuck or buried. To me, it sounded like a challenge. It sounded perfect. I thought I'd seen it all before. Storms that pinned me down for days, cliffs that nearly peeled me off like dead skin, close calls with black bears nosing into my campsite. I thought nothing could shake me anymore. But believe me, when you see something like that out there, I was wrong. I packed light but careful. A 4-season tent, a good down bag, ice axe, crampons, a stove for melting snow, freeze-dried meals, and a headlamp. Extra flares and enough layers to keep me alive if the weather turned ugly. I strapped everything tight to my pack and left the truck at a trailhead no one uses after December. The world was still when I started out. Nothing but white valleys and jagged peaks rising like broken teeth. That's exactly what I loved about it. The solitude, the silence, the feeling that no one else on earth was close enough to matter. The adrenaline. Out there, the only thing that counted was your own strength and your own grit. I thought that was all I needed. But that mountain taught me different. Or, correctly, the thing on that mountain taught me different. I started to climb smooth. The snow was packed firm along with the lower ridges, and each step bit clean into the crust with a satisfying crunch. The air was razor sharp, the kind that stings your lungs but makes you feel more awake than a gallon of coffee. I could see my breath plume in clouds, hanging for a second before the wind shredded it away. Every muscle ached under the weight of my pack, but I loved it. That strain was proof I was alive, proof I was doing what I was meant to. By mid-morning, I climbed high enough to see across the whole valley. White stretched in every direction, ridges folded into one another like frozen waves. Pines below looked like dark brushstrokes smeared across the snow. The peaks ahead were jagged and cruel, black stone poking through where the snow couldn't cling. It was beautiful in a way that makes you feel small, like you've stepped into a place older and bigger than you'll ever understand. And it was silent. Not the soft silence of a city park in the winter, but something heavier. My boots and the creak of my pack straps were the only sounds that I could hear. No birdsong, no distant trickle of water, not even the pop of ice cracking. Just frozen stillness pressing in on all sides. That's when I noticed these weird tracks. They cut across the slope ahead of me, half buried under wind-blown snow. At first glance, I thought maybe snowshoes. Maybe somebody was out here, and they were crazy enough to be out here like me. But these things, as I kept looking, were wide. They were long, toes pointed outwards, kind of splayed like if you stretch your fingers as far as they can go. But the stride that I was looking at was too long and the impressions were too deep. I knelt to take a closer look. They weren't Paw prints? They weren't boots either. Almost human, but not. Like someone had pulled the shape of a human foot way too far. A chill slipped under my jacket, but I shook it off. Probably just another climber, I told myself. Maybe someone hunting late season, passing through before me. I pushed forward, back into the rhythm. The wind picked up a little, whispering around the rocks. I told myself I wasn't uneasy, but I glanced over my shoulder more than once. By the time the sun slid down the peaks, the cold turned mean. My fingers were stiff even in gloves, and the wind had a bite that cut through my jacket like I'd forgotten to zip it up. I found a flat spot tucked between lines of boulders and set camp the way I always did. Fast, efficient, nothing fancy. 4-season tent staked tight against the gust, sleeping bag unrolled inside, stove lit just long enough to boil snow into water. I ate one of those tasteless free-dried meals, washed it down with hot tea from my thermos, and stretched out my back against the pack. Minimalist camping wasn't about comfort. It was about stripping things down to what kept you alive. I liked that. Out here, extra weight slowed you down. Every ounce had to earn its place. The silence stayed heavy, but every so often it broke. A crack echoed through the trees, sharp and quick. I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth, just listening. The wind pushed against the tent, low and steady, but this sound was different. Then came something softer, a low murmur, almost like a voice carried thin through the air. I decided it was just the mountain. Wind could twist through canyons and sound like all kinds of things. Whispers, laughter, even your own name if your imagination was big enough. I'd heard it before. This smell drifted in without warning, though, riding on the cold air. It smelled like death, no two ways about that. I zipped the tent tight and forced myself not to think about it. Sleep that night came in scraps, broken by every creak of ice or shift of wind. When the first gray light slid over the ridge, I crawled out. Took in the sights, admired the beauty, but when I looked down, I saw something that I didn't admire. Footprints circling the tent. Not mine. Those too wide, too long things that I'd seen earlier. They were spaced too far apart. Each impression warped, toes digging deep, heels narrow, stride uneven. They looped around my camp in a wide circle, close enough that I should have heard whoever or whatever had made them. I stood there for a long time, breath fogging in the cold, staring at those tracks. I was trying to make sense of what I was looking at. What was out here with me? Nobody should be out here. And if it was an animal, it should have been noisier. And these tracks, well, they weren't tracking. For the first time in years of chasing adrenaline, I didn't feel like I was in control. I had a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't shake. So I decided to do what I always do. Get some adrenaline. The morning climb should have cleared my head. Movement always did. Ice axe biting into crust, crampons crunching steady rhythm, lungs burning in the thin air, but I couldn't shake the image of those prints circling my tent that day. Every time my boots sank into the snow, I imagined another set pressing down just behind me. Halfway up the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath and let the view soak in. The valley stretched wide and white below, the world washed clean of color. My chest rose and fell heavy. I could see the steam curling out in thick clouds. I liked to watch it, as you blow out, watch the cloud of breath gather, and then just disappear. But then I heard something I was never expecting in a million years. My name. I know a lot of stories that you hear your name being called. But let me tell you, that's the real deal. When you're out there, and something like that is following you, I think the first thing it tries to figure out is what to call you, so it can lure you out into the open, or behind a tree, or behind a rock, and take you. When I heard it, it wasn't loud, or even clear, just a breath of sound in the wind. I turned fast, heart spiking, but there was nobody behind me, obviously. I was out here completely alone. It was just snow and stone. I told myself it was an echo, maybe my own voice carried back from the cliffs, but I knew that was a stupid explanation. I climbed another dozen yards before it came again. It sounded exactly the same. The skin between my shoulder blades prickled. I lifted my head, scanning the ridges above. High up against the skyline, something stood, I'm sure of that. Thin, incredibly thin, bony. Bonier than anything I've ever seen before. It was taller than any man, too. Arms hanging real low, nearly brushing its knees. Shoulders hunched like it was folding itself in from the cold wind. The skin, or what I could see of it, looked pale, stretched over bone like frostbitten leather. It didn't move. It didn't wave. It didn't climb. It just swayed there, a dark notch against the gray sky, watching me. I blinked. I blinked hard. I tried to clear the sting out of my eyes. It was gone. 1 second it was there, standing plain as the peaks. The next, nothing. No path leading away, no spray of snow from a leap, just empty ridge. I stayed frozen, axe planted in the crust, every muscle tight. The silence pressed heavier than before, thick enough I swore I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. For the first time in my life, the mountain didn't feel like my playground. It felt like someone else's home, and I wasn't welcome. I camped lower that night, thinking maybe I'd imagined the figure on the ridge, but knowing that I hadn't. I told myself I was tired, that altitude messes with your head and plays tricks on your eyes. It was like I had two brains at that time, the logical part and the realistic part that knows what it saw. But I kept repeating that story over and over as I boiled more snow for water and chewed on another tasteless meal. But the part of my brain that kept trying to explain it away, it lost out, because no story could explain the unease crawling under my skin. Now, I've been in life or death situations plenty of times with my lifestyle, but here, I knew something was terribly wrong. And then I heard something else, worse than my name. My voice. Soft at first, drifting from the trees, but unmistakably mine. Hello? The exact tone that I'd used earlier when I muttered into the silence. It was like whatever was out there had recorded my voice and played it back. There was a pause, then again the same pitch, same breath. Hello? I sat up, fumbled for the headlamp, but before I could switch it on, the voice shifted. My name, low and drawn out, stretched wrong, like someone speaking for the very first time. The tent shuddered. Snow slid from the branches above, thumping down around me. My breath came in short clouds as I unzipped the flap, just enough to peer out. At first, there was nothing. Just the smear of moonlight on the snow, the black of the trees beyond. But then my eyes caught movement. A shape, tall and thin, just like I'd seen before, half hidden behind the trunk of a spruce. It swayed slowly. I yanked a flare from my pack, snapped the cap, and let the red light hiss to life. It filled the clearing like a glow. That's when I saw the whole thing. The light caught these hollow, sunken eyes in this deep, skull-like head. Skin stretched tight, gray and cracked, lips barely there over teeth that seemed too many and too sharp. It didn't flinch at the flare. It didn't back away. It only breathed, rasping, wet, like broken bellows forcing air through frozen lungs. And then it shifted sideways, just out of full view, and it started circling slow. That's when it hit me. It wasn't trying to attack. Not yet, at least. It was playing with me, or testing me, hunting me in its own time, in its own way. I kept the flare in my hand as long as my nerves would last, but eventually I had to put it down. I needed to go back in the tent. I'd spent years chasing danger, but that night, for the first time, I felt danger chasing me. I didn't wait for dawn. The second that I felt it was bright enough, I tore down camp. My hands fumbled with frozen straps, my breath coming out in ragged clouds. I stuffed gear anywhere that it would fit. The mountain climb was over. I wasn't finishing it. I just wanted off that ridge. I kept glancing, looking around, checking everywhere as I worked my way down. I was certain that I'd see that pale face again. Just empty white slopes and shadows of the tree lines greeted me, though. But then eventually I did catch movement. Up on the ridge above me, a shape kept pace. That same emaciated figure, swaying with the wind as it glided between trees. My pulse pounded in my ears. I pushed harder, feet slipping on icy patches, axe grabbing for balance. A scream tore through the air, raw and inhuman, shaking the stillness of the valley. It didn't echo like a wolf or carry like an avalanche crack. It rattled, tearing through the air like it wanted to break something inside of me. I staggered. My knees were weak, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I saw it again, it was on all fours, tearing through the snow like it weighed nothing. Arms and legs moved too fast, the body lurching forward in jerks. Snow sprayed up in sheets behind it as it kept pace, mouth open in another scream that scraped through my chest. I ran harder than I ever have. My crampons caught, sent me stumbling, nearly throwing me face first into the slope. I clawed with my axe, righted myself, kept going, ignored my burning lungs. I couldn't look back anymore. If I did, I'd freeze, and freezing meant dying. Pure instinct drove me forward, legs pumping, heart ready to tear out of my chest. I don't remember how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? Days? It doesn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting off of that mountain. Everything blurred into snow and stone. Every sound was drowned out by that gasping breath behind me and my own panting. All I know is, somehow I kept my footing, and somehow I got lower. I got closer to the valley, and only then did the noise fade, like it had pulled back, letting me go. By the time I stumbled into the valley, my legs were shaking so hard I could barely keep upright. Frost clung to my beard. My fingers were stiff with cold, and every breath rasped like fire in my chest. I don't even remember the last mile. I just remember seeing the dark shape of my truck through the trees and nearly collapsing when I reached it. I cranked the heater, but the shaking wouldn't stop. It wasn't the cold that had me shivering. It was what I'd seen, what had chased me. I didn't tell a soul. Not that night, not the next day. Not for almost a month. Every time I thought about it, my throat closed up. People already called me reckless, a thrill junkie. If I told them I'd been chased off a mountain by some nightmare, they'd laugh me right off the map. But then I heard about hikers, a pair of them that had seen something similar to mine. There were search parties sent out when one of them went missing for a while. Dogs, snowmobiles, the whole thing. When they found the poor guy, he just kept muttering about something calling his name. I knew that he'd seen the real thing. The same thing that I did. That's when I knew that I hadn't imagined it. Whatever had circled my camp, whatever screamed on the ridge, it hadn't just let me go. It found someone else to torment. I haven't chased adrenaline since then. Haven't climbed, haven't skydived, haven't thrown myself in danger like it was a game. Because I learned the hard way. It's not a game. The mountain broke me that night. I thought I was up there alone, testing myself against the cold and the cliffs and the emptiness. But I wasn't. And the mountain wasn't empty at all.